Hi everyone, happy Saturday. Welcome to the end of week 3 of week 5 of the course. Thank you for being engaged in class. I really appreciate that. So today I'm just going to review really quickly in about half an hour or less the material that we covered this past week. So the first half of the week we focused on the Pai, who are comprised essentially of the Walapai and the Havasupai, who are canyon peoples. And then we spent time looking at the Yavapai, who are traditionally the enemies of the Walapai and the Havasupai. All three of those tribes speak the human language, and they were one people actually, including the Utes, according to Trimble. Okay, but today the Pai are collectively known as the Havasupai and the Walapai. And then there's the Yavapai. Okay? And on Thursday, we spent time looking at the Apaches and their history. Okay? So when it comes to the history of the area, it bears noting certain high level things or overview of things where New Spain existed in this area up until 1821 when the Spanish Empire collapsed. Between 1821 and 1848, it was Mexico. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe ceded a large chunk of land, including this area of the country, except for southern Arizona, and we are in southern Arizona. So let me just explain. So Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded a large chunk of land from Mexico to the United States. And then in 1853, there was the Gadsden Purchase, which purchased another chunk of land, which is where Tucson is. So it's essentially a chunk of land south of the Gila River. So without the Gadsden Purchase, for example, we would be in Sonora, Mexico right now. But because because of the Gadsden Purchase, we're actually in Tucson, Arizona, United States right now. Okay, 1862, we have the Homestead Act of 1862, which incentivized settlers from the East Coast to come to the western part of the country, which was comprised of territories at that time, so that they could come and settle the territory. 1877, we have the Desert Lands Act of 1877, which essentially incentivized settlers to come to the desert west or desert southwest and build economies, develop mines, develop farms, develop ranching businesses. The cities that were emerging, of course, they had their own water rights, which were municipal water rights. I also talked to you on Tuesday about the prior appropriation doctrine. You don't need to know the details about that. It's just for you to know the context of how things work in the West, to the point where land out here in the West, legally speaking, has no value without water rights. Okay? And essentially what the prior appropriation doctrine manages is surface waters, like rivers and lakes and creeks. It was not until 1980 when the state of Arizona began to regulate groundwater pumping, which is different. Okay? And then I also talked about the Winters Doctrine or the Reserved Water Rights Doctrine of 1908. Okay, I also mentioned the settlements. Those are important, okay, because Trimble does speak about some of the settlements. Like the Yavapai, for example, the Fort McDowell Yavapai have a Tribal Water Rights Settlement Act from 1990. Okay, so just giving you a quick overview of the history of the region. Okay, when it comes to the Walapai and the Havasupai, the center of the world for them was the San Francisco peaks. Okay, that's important to know because it shows the overlap and the trading and mingling that happened amongst the people of the area, the indigenous people of the area. Because, for example, for the Navajos and the Hopis, the San Francisco peaks are also sacred. One of the sacred mountains for one of the four sacred mountains for the Navajo, for example, is the San Francisco peaks. So again, very important for you to keep that in mind when it comes to these people. So generally speaking, the Wallapai and the Havasupai did not have much contact with the Europeans because they were canyon peoples until the 1850s and the 1860s. So in 1863, gold was discovered in the area. And the mines started to come, and with the mines, it was also the farming and the ranching and the settlement in general. The United States government at first tried to remove, and they force marched the Wallapai from the Grand Canyon to the Colorado River Indian Reservation, which is out there in the desert. It's a more arid region. They didn't like it. A lot of them escaped. Of course, a lot of them died because this was a forced march. They returned to the canyon, and it wasn't until the 1880s when the Wallapai Reservation and the Havasupai Reservation were created. Okay, so the Wallapai Reservation was created in 1883, and the Havasupai Reservation was created in 1882. Okay, one important thing to keep in mind about these two reservations, and especially for the Havasupai one, because the Havasupai Reservation is smaller, is that initially these reservations were containment camps or prison camps, essentially, where the tribal members were not allowed to come and go freely into or outside of the reservation. They needed permission from the Indian agent of that particular reservation. So these two tribes, the Wallapai and the Havasupai, they were nomadic but in the sense where they spent the summer months at the bottom of the canyon and the winter months at the top of the canyon. And with the reservation was created inside the canyon, so it meant that the tribal members had to spend their entire year at the bottom of the canyon, and this wasn't something that they liked because of the high walls of the canyon. During the winter months, they wouldn't get much sunlight, only a few hours of sunlight, and it was cold, of course. So they didn't like that, and eventually that changed. Eventually, things progressed, so to speak, until how things are now. But the tribal members of the Wallapai and the Havasupai had to endure a lot of the things that other tribes had to go through. Assimilation practices like the boarding schools, for example, the Allotment Act of 1887, for example, Indian Reorganization Act. Both the Havasupais and the Wallapais have constitutions and tribal councils based off of the Indian Reorganization Act. One thing that separates the two peoples is the economy. So, according to Trimble, the Wallapai economy is based off of cattle ranching, and the Havasupai economy thrives on tourism. Okay, so that's the gist of the Wallapais and the Havasupais. The other group that we covered was the Yavapais. So the Yavapais were also nomadic, but their territory was much larger than the one for the Wallapais and the Havasupais, in the sense that they were roaming over the hills and they had a hunter-gatherer culture. They also spoke the human language. Okay, so they spoke the human language, and they resisted containment because remember that the reservation system was a method of containment that the United States had to deal with the quote unquote Indian problem. How are we going to deal with the Indian problem? The reservation system was a way for the United States to deal with that. Okay. And the Yavapai didn't want to be contained. And because of that, they paid dearly. There were some massacres committed against them by the U.S. Army. They were forced marched in 1871 to the San Carlos reservation. They didn't like it. Eventually, they were able to work with the U.S. government to get their reservations established. They have essentially three main reservations, but they are scattered. Like there are small reservations that they have. They have the Fort McDowell reservation, which was established in 1903. The Camp Verde and Middle Verde reservation, which was established in 1910, from 1910 to 1916, and the Prescott Indian Reservation, which was established in 1935. Okay, so you have these reservations. They had to fight for their water rights. So the Fort McDowell Indian Reservation got their settlement, their water rights settlement, in 1990. That was a long fight that they had with the city of Phoenix and the Salt River Project, which is it manages the water in the city of Phoenix, and it's an electric company, essentially, an electricity company. Okay, they have found ways to thrive, mostly through gaming. So the Fort McDowell Indian Reservation has a casino. Okay, the Prescott Indian Reservation has a casino. So they have casinos, and that's how they sustain their economies. It's not perfect, of course, and we see some issues like loss of language, for example, but they all are finding ways of dealing with that. Like, for example, with the Wallapai, for example, they took over control of their schools in the 70s from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and now their schools are teaching the language again and teaching the culture. So again, that is the gist of the peoples of the Pai and the Yavapai. Okay, then we spent a lot of time looking at the Apaches. So the Apaches were essentially like the Navajos. They are Athabascan speaking peoples. They are nomadic, but they had different bands, and the different bands reacted to colonization in different ways. So we had the Western Apache, for example, with the bands, which are comprised of the San Carlos Apache, the White Mountain Apache, the CBQ Apache, and the Tonto Apache. The Eastern Apache are comprised of the Lipan Apache, Jicarilla Apache, and Mescalero Apache. Okay, so keep that in mind when it comes to their territories. Ultimately, once everything was said and done in the 1870s and 1880s, because that's when the Apache reservations were established, we had two large Apache reservations in Arizona, with Apaches mingling with other tribes, like the Yavapai Apache reservation, for example, here and there. And then in New Mexico, we have the Jicarilla Apache reservation in northern Mexico, around the Dulce, New Mexico area, present day Dulce, New Mexico. And then there's the Mescalero Apache in southeastern Mexico, New Mexico, excuse me, where the Mescalero, Lipan, and Chiricahua Apache live. Which, by the way, the Chiricahua, they could be called Eastern Apache, but they're really in a category of their own. Okay, I will tell you a bit more about them in a bit as we continue. So again, we have these different bands of Apaches, and just watching how they reacted to things. Um, Culturally speaking, as I said, linguistically also they spoke the Athabascan language. Similar to the Navajos, they also had a matrilocal or matrilineal society where the family is centered around the woman, and the man, if he wants to get married into a family, like he gets married into the woman's family. So that's why they were saying that the trunk of the tree is the woman, the arms are the children, and the leaves are the men. Okay, so that's essentially a way of looking at the Apache culture. um, Historically speaking, the Apaches had clashes with the Spaniards because they were raiders. Okay, so even the word Apache, it's the word, the Zuni word for enemy. Okay, out here in the Tucson area, for example, they had a reputation of raiding the Tohono O'odham. Okay, so when it was usually the men who went out raiding, but the Apache also had women warriors. Okay, and when they raided, they raided for goods, they raided um, for cattle, they raided for sheep, they raided for people also, because sometimes they would capture young men and women and take them back to wherever they had their camp, and they would raise those people as their own. Okay. The Spaniards weren't happy with this, and the United States were even less happy happy with this, to the point that in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, part of that treaty was that the United States Army was going to control the Apache raids, and they were going to prevent the Apache raids from going into Mexico. That didn't help because the territory of the Chiricahuas, for example, their territory went into northern Mexico, and they raided throughout that entire period. They didn't care if it was Spaniards, the British, or Euro Americans, I should say, right? The descendants, generally speaking, the descendants of the British colonies. Um, they didn't care if they were raiding Spaniards, Euro Americans, or other Indians. They were practicing their culture because raiding was a coming of age thing for the young men also, just like the puberty ceremony was an important, pivotal aspect of Apache culture. Um, the Spanish tried to control the Apaches through different ways, but they couldn't. And then their empire collapsed in 1821. And then after 1821, the raiding and the warfare, it continued to the point where Trimble says that the road between El Paso and Santa Fe was called El Camino Real, but also it had a nickname where it was called La Jornada del Muerto, or the Journey of the Dead Man. I told you about my own translation about that. Trimble said the Journey of Death. I don't think that is accurate. I think it's that the more accurate translation is the Journey of the Dead Man. So the thing about the Apache Wars is that the band of Apaches that has the reputation of having resisted the United States with a lot of vigor, I would say, is the Chiricahua Apache. Okay, so the Chiricahuas, they fought tooth and nail to keep their way of life intact. It didn't work. They were chased by the U.S. Army. Eventually, in 1886, the Apache leaders like Geronimo, who is very famous, surrendered to the U.S. Army. Initially, they were told that they were going to be held in captivity for a few years. What ended up happening is that they were transferred over to exile into Florida. These were military prisons. They were transferred to Florida, then they were transferred to Alabama, and finally to Fort Sill with the Kiowa people in Oklahoma. Okay? Eventually, and of course I'm fast forwarding with history. Eventually, the Chiricahuas moved into the Mescalero Apache Reservation in southeastern New Mexico, okay, along with the Lipans and of course the Mescaleros. That's the history of this. The Jicarillas, what happened with them is that they were being hemmed in by the Navajos, the Spaniards, and the Comanches. So, according to history, the Comanches actually forced them into the hills from their traditional territories. When they were gone, you would say when their backs were turned, the Mexican government gave a land grant of a lot of the Jicarilla Apache lands to choose Spaniard or choose Mexican citizens at that point. They were Mexican citizens. Okay, when the Jicarilla Apaches were able to return or to be able to come back to that territory, they had a hard time because that land was already taken. And what the United States wanted to do, actually, it wanted to take them over to Fort Sumner at first. And then it took them to the Mescalero Apache Reservation. But they didn't like it. So finally, they got their reservation in 1887. They got their reservation where the Jicarilla Apache Reservation is at. And in the late 1890s, I believe it's 1897, their reservation was expanded, and here they are. Okay, Apache, in the Arizona side, we have the Fort Apache Reservation and the San Carlos Apache Reservation. Initially, they were the same reservation, but they were separated. Okay, into the San Carlos Apache and the Fort Apache Reservation. Let's see. Let me see what else I'm going to tell you about this, because of course this is just review, and I wanted to keep the video to less than 30 minutes. Right now we are at 22 minutes. It says here that the San Carlos Apache is comprised of Tonto Apache, CVQ Apache, White Mountain Apache, and San Carlos Apaches. Okay, and I'm just confirming here that the San Carlos Apache and the Fort Apache reservations they were one reservation, but they were split. Okay, they were divided in 1897. Okay, let's see. So when it comes to the dates, I think I misspoke earlier when I said that the Jicarilla Apache Reservation was extended, but it doesn't say in here that it was in 1897. I was conflating that with the Apache, the San Carlos Apache and the White Mountain Apache. So this is just to tell you that even I get confused with these dates. I'm not asking you to remember these dates. The dates are for context. Of course, there are important dates like the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the date 1821 when the Spanish Empire collapsed. Those are important dates because they are essentially ground-breaking dates. But when it comes to these reservations, yes, remember 1871 was when the big San Carlos Apache Reservation was established. 1897, that's when it was divided. Okay, 1883, 1882 for the Hualapai and the Havasupai Reservation. So keep those for context for understanding when these things were happening. Generally speaking, for these reservations, the Mescalero reservation has done well with cattle ranching. They have a resort and they have a logging economy. The San Carlos Apache has tried its hand at cattle ranching, but according to the textbook, they haven't done as well as the Fort Apache reservation, where they have cattle ranching, or also they also have big game hunting. One distinction is that the Fort Apache reservation includes the traditional territories for the CBQ and White Mountain Apache, okay, who are collectively known as coyoteros, according to the book. Then the Jicarilla Apache Reservation, once it was set, once that the land was restored to them, their economy has thrived in oil and gas drilling, cattle ranching, sheep herding, and of course their traditional economies. But they also have timber. So in all, when it comes to these cultures, they've gone through a lot of strife, they've gone through a lot of challenges. But one thing that I want to drive home, and I'll really begin to start speaking about this in the last few weeks of the course, is that they are survivors. They are not victims, okay? This area of the country where we're at right now in Tucson, Arizona, has gone through a lot of tumult, a lot of changes, okay? It's like I have my house in Tucson, right? And then 1821 comes in, and Tucson is no longer in New Spain. Now Tucson is part of Mexico. And then 1848 rolls in, and now my house that I used to have in New Spain now is in the United States. Okay? And then on top of that, you have the United States implementing and deploying this policy of containment and assimilation on the tribes. Okay? Then we have the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. Then we have the Indian Claims Commission in the latter part of the 1940s, right? Then we have termination, which didn't touch the tribes here, but it was happening, right? Then we have the relocation area. And then we have the self-determination period, which is essentially what we're seeing now, okay? Is tribes essentially making lemonade out of the lemons that they got, okay? I'm not by saying this, I'm not minimizing or aggrandizing anything of what has happened or obfuscating. But by now you should know what I think about these processes. But it is what it is. The history is where it's at, and this is where the tribes are now. But when you look at a tribe like the San Carlos Apache reservation, for example, how are they doing economically? Why are they not doing economically well? These are things that we have to keep in mind, because sometimes the economic system that gets imposed on these tribal communities is not the traditional economic system that they had, which makes them struggle, okay? There's also a question of how or what kind of resources that particular reservation has. Or is that particular reservation comprised of the traditional homelands of the people? Or what if they were nomadic, right? What if they were nomadic and all of a sudden they are confined to this one place and they can't move, right? What if they are forced to pay taxes on their land, right? Like, remember that one story about the Havasupai and how the forest or the National Forest Service, they didn't want the Havasupai to develop squatters' rights at the top of the canyon, so they destroyed their winter cabins while they were away in the summer. And then the service built cabins like Euro-American style caverns. And on top of that, they started to charge rent for the cabins, for lands that were theirs already, that were that or belonged to the Havasupai already. Okay, so this is the history that I'm teaching you. Um, Please let me know if you get confused. Um, my brain, generally speaking, when it comes to dates, I remember them because I learn them and I read them all the time. But some of these dates, when it comes to the reservations, my brain gets jumbled sometimes. And so don't worry if your own brain gets jumbled about these dates. Just have a general picture of when, like for example, the reservations, the Apache reservations, they were established between 1870 and, well, 1870s and 1880s. That's when the Apache reservations were created. Okay, so keep this in mind. Again, if you have questions, let me know. I will post this, and we will continue to have review sessions, and we will move onwards and forwards with the class and learning the material. Thank you so much.